The Agricultural Revolution. What is the Agricultural Revolution? The Neolithic Revolution is sometimes termed the Agricultural Revolution. It was a process of transition from a nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherer communities to one of agriculture and pastoralism, as well as the start of a sedentary lifestyle. We can see here at A, that is the Paleolithic period, the hunter-gatherer period, and the B, the second part of the image, that is the Neolithic village. That's a Neolithic village at Abu Huraira in Syria. So instead of constantly moving in groups to hunt animals, Neolithic people developed agriculture and domesticated animals, allowing them to have larger food stores. The term Neolithic Revolution was introduced by an archaeologist named Gordon Childe. Some writers prefer the term Agricultural Revolution. Our entire way of life today stems from the Agricultural Revolution. In our fast-paced world, we may not give thought to where our fruits come from, our vegetables, our grains, where they come from, where we shop in the store, where that stuff comes from, the way in which we live today in our comfortable homes, in the towns we live in, or living near towns, um, eating food developed on farms, attending schools, all of that stuff is a consequence of the agricultural revolution. The agricultural revolution was necessary for the rise of modern civilization. It is the basis for civilization. Agriculture was one of the most important developments in all of human history, which occurred during what historians call the Neolithic age. We can see a timeline there on our right. So the agricultural revolution began around 10,500 and 6,000 years ago. This does not imply that 10,500 years ago land was cultivated all over the world. At that time, food production started only in selected areas. It ended as civilization started to rise around 3500 BC. The term Neolithic comes from two words, neo or new and lithic or stone. Sometimes this period is referred to as the New Stone Age. Neolithic is the youngest period of the Stone Age. Humans during this period used stone tools and weapons, but they were starting to enhance their tools. We know from our previous lecture how humans previously lived as hunter-gatherers in small and mobile groups, collecting fruits and roots. So living in constant migration in search of food. So you can imagine how this new revolution completely changed man's way of life. The making of stone tools was based on a finer stone process. For example, the grinding or smoothing, polishing the stone, cutting it, drilling of stone objects. They also process things like bones and horns. These stone tools show us how early humans made things, how they lived, how they hunted, how they interacted with their surroundings, and how they would go on to evolve. The oldest stone kit shows hammerstones with battering on their surfaces, stone cores with series of flake scars along edges, sharp stone flakes useful for cutting edges. In the later part of the early Stone Age, humans began to strike larger flakes. They shaped them and made new tools like the hand axe. So the Neolithic toolkit becomes very diverse, reflecting cultural diversity. The making of stone tools was based on a finer stone processing. For example, as we had said, grinding, cutting, drilling, and so on. So the image of those stone tools also shows us how the tools of the Neolithic Stone Age were much smaller in size, and along the way during the Neolithic Age, bigger stones were later given shape. The Stone Age is divided in three periods: Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, Mesolithic, Middle Age, Stone Age, and then the Neolithic. So the main characteristics of the Neolithic period are the introduction of ceramic pottery, the use of new techniques for processing of stones, transition onto the system of economy based on agriculture and livestock breeding. In the next slide, you will see the Fertile Crescent. The farming is thought to have first happened in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. The Fertile Crescent is fed by the waterways of the Tigris Euphrates rivers, um, which is present-day Iraq, Indus River, and the Nile River. The earliest evidence of agricultural development occurs in the area known as the Fertile Crescent. Jarmo is one of the earliest villages. Agriculture also developed in other areas such as China and Mesoamerica, but that's at a later date. Because of this region's relatively abundant access to water, the earliest civilizations were established in the Fertile Crescent, including the Sumerians. Its areas covers what are now southern Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Egypt, and parts of Turkey and Iran. Two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, they regularly flood the area, and the Nile also runs through parts of it. Irrigation and agriculture developed here because of the fertile soil near these rivers. This image shows us the diffusion of agriculture. Now, this transition took place at a varying pace in different regions of the world. Agriculture slowly spread from core areas, Southwest Asia, China, and Southeast Asia, the Americas, and so it diffuses through the world. Humans began to produce food for the first time in the valleys of two great Asian rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. Modern research can indicate with certainty 5 other areas where the first domestication of plants took place, which would be Southwest Asia, also known as the Near East or the Fertile Crescent, then the second China, the third Mesoamerica. The term is applied to Central and Southern Mexico and the areas adjacent to Central America, then the Andes of South America and possibly the adjacent Amazon basin and eastern United States. Further research has indicated that food production most likely also took place in the Africa's Sahel zone, West Africa, Ethiopia, and New Guinea. So food production began at different times in different areas. In some areas, it was the result of independent discoveries, while in other areas, it was from borrowing from neighboring societies. So the sedentary village life and agricultural transition. So now, if you remember from our previous lecture on the hunter-gatherers, how the homes looked, what the homes were made from from their natural resources, the leaves. So now what we see is that the rough homes from nature, they start to look like village settlements in the Neolithic period. There's the conscious cultivation of plants, which led to agriculture. There's a steady supply of food and no need to forage. Needs are supplied in a permanent and stable way. There's growth in population. The society begins to support additional people. There's the use of groundstone tools and the development of ceramics. When they moved from hunting to gathering, food communities began to increase their economic reliance on the production of food, gradually turning into agricultural communities. So people moved from gathering food to food production. Humans began to slowly domesticate plants and animal stocks in Southwest Asia. People took up new ways of making a livelihood in certain parts of the world, notably the Fertile Crescent region of the Middle East. People moved from a diet they could get from hunting and gathering fruits, vegetables, lean meats, fish, eggs, nuts, and seeds, roots to an agricultural period that consists of cultivated food. People learned to cultivate crops instead of relying on nature and learned to domesticate animals. There is an emergence of a new type of social organization. So now, if we want to provide a clear picture of the Neolithic Revolution, it is necessary to sketch phenomena such as agricultural transition or plant and animal domestication and discuss the influence that the agricultural revolution had on human communities. So we need to look at the social consequences, we need to look at the medical consequences, and we need to look at the technological consequences. When we look at the social consequences, there was an increase in the surplus of food, which had an impact on the growth in the human population, and an increase in the number of individual human communities. People were no longer foraging, they could have and raise more children. So now a nomadic lifestyle and associated restrictions resulted in the fact that women in the hunter-gatherer communities were only able to raise children at intervals of at least 4 years, while women in agricultural communities could raise children at 2-year intervals. The bigger populations came with new ways of organizing. There were radical changes in patterns of working and living together, and the new patterns of social life developed. People now had to tend to crops between planting and harvesting, and so they could not just wander off for months at a time. They had to work out ways of cooperating with each other to clear the land, to ensure that there's regular tending to crops, weeding, watering of crops, the storing of harvest, the sharing of stocks, and the rearing of children. This reorganized the way people now lived and worked together. Other significant developments was the development of weapons for warfare as well as for hunting became more prevalent. Now we look at the medical consequences. The development of densely populated sedentary societies in which people lived in close proximity with domesticated animals and in conditions of poor hygiene led to the easier spread of disease. Communities which were which first domesticated animals came into contact with new diseases and consequently were the first to build up immunities to these diseases. The development of trade contributed to the spread of disease. This resulted in plagues that could take out almost entire indigenous communities, sometimes resulting in a mortality of 90%. Then we have the emerging of new technologies. There's better agricultural tools and weapons. People were exchanging inventions, bringing about new technologies. So the Neolithic revolution contributed to the rapid and systematic technological development of human societies. This process began with the use of river floods and burning of forests for cultivation, constructing ever more efficient tools and leading to the development of complex irrigation systems and the introduction of various land management techniques. In the period between 7,000 and 4,000 years ago, the first stone and wood implements were used in the cultivation of land. The first primitive plows were used at least 5,000 years ago. The first irrigation systems were created probably in Egypt approximately 7,000 years ago. The Sumerians started building irrigation and drainage canals 5,000 years ago in the Euphrates and Tigris region. Over time, they developed a technique to increase the fertility of the soil, which yielded smaller crops due to cultivation. This was achieved by means of prolonged fallow periods or by fertilization. People also systematically worked on improving domesticated species of plants and animals through selective breeding of plants and line and cross-breeding of animals. Now, when we look at plant domestication, there are plants that played an important role in the development of human civilization, what we can call the founder crops. These include emmer wheat, ear corn, wheat, barley, lentil, pea, chickpea, bitter vetch, and flax. In all likelihood, plant domestication took place in the Fertile Crescent. Several species were domesticated independently in various parts of the world at different, sometimes distant periods of time. As a result, it is sometimes difficult to define the time and region of the first domestication of a given species. For example, the origins of rice and millet farming date back to the same Neolithic period in China. The world's oldest known rice paddy field, discovered in eastern China in 2007, revealed evidence of ancient cultivation techniques such as flood, and fire control. So pottery became important. So now, when you are no longer moving around, you will need something to store your food in. Pottery becomes important. Humans began to express themselves through architecture. Some homes from this period have walls covered in murals with scenes of daily life or religious imagery. When we look at animal domestication, animal domestication is seen as a byproduct of plant domestication. Animals were used in the cultivation of agriculture. It is difficult to determine either the region or the date of the first domestication in the case of particular species of animals, especially given that some of them were domesticated independently in different regions of the world. Dogs were the first domesticated species. This was also a process that unfolded over thousands of years. Dogs were bred for skills such as hunting. From among the 148 existing large herbivorous and mammals, excuse me, humans only managed to domesticate 14. The major five domesticated species that spread almost all over the world and played a major role in the development of human civilization are sheep, goat, pig, cattle, and horse. The minor 9 domesticated animal species that live only in certain areas and played a significant role in the development of civilization in different regions are things like the Arabian one-humped camel, the Bactrian two-humped camel, the llama, the alpaca, donkey, reindeer, water buffalo, yak, barley cattle, and mutton. It seems that the most important factors with regards to some species of animals being successfully domesticated while others were not include things like diet, growth rate, breeding habits, disposition, temperament, tendencies for them to panic, and sociability. So now let's look at the explanations regarding the roots of the emergence of agriculture. So there are a number of speculations as to why people developed agriculture. The first one being domestication for religious purposes. So the religious use of animals, for example, sacrificial ceremonies, sacred oils, incense, and religious use of bread. Other explanation, hunter-gatherers had the sophisticated knowledge of plants and animals. People had accumulated immense amount of knowledge of plant life over hundreds of generations of living off wild vegetation. The hunter-gatherers observed the weather, the growth patterns of plants, and the seasonal migration of animals. They began to use this knowledge to secure food supplies. When people observed how the seeds of edible plants thrown on dump heaps grew into robust plants because of the abundance of nutrients available there, they would follow that process. With time, those accidental crops induced humans to undertake deliberate and planned activities, which resulted in the invention of agriculture. So people also collected the seeds of wild grains and other edible plants and disposed of non-edible plants growing close to edible plants to provide better conditions for their growth. Most likely, people noticed the dependence between the number of plants of a specific species and the amount of grain scattered on the occasion of their collection. Humans began to sow seeds of desired plants, in this way hoping to receive larger quantities of that food. Some argue that the agricultural revolution was sparked by climate change. Climate change gave people a limited choice. The warming of the earth in the post-ice age period allowed humans to stay in one place where crops were planted and animals were domesticated. In some areas like the southeast of Turkey, a family could gather wild cereals in 3 weeks to keep them alive for a year. They did not need to move around anymore. So climate change led to the concentration of areas rich in resources, and this contributed to sedentarism and the growth in the human population. So scientists have speculated that the warming of the earth may have played a role in the development of farming. Rising temperatures following the ice age caused barley and white wheat to grow in great abundance in the Fertile Crescent. Due to this, people began to build permanent homes in the area rather than living as nomads. Population pressure may have also initiated plant domestication. Once a decision was made to depend on agriculture, the population inevitably increased. Or it could also just be a combination of all of these factors. So now we're going to look at the similarities and differences between the agriculturalists and the hunter-gatherers. So there was no private property in both periods. There was still nothing resembling class and state authority until many thousands of years after the first turn to agriculture in the late Urbid period, 4000 BC. People were not hoarding stocks of personal possession at the expense of others. They still believed in sharing. Instead, individual households were integrated into a wider social grouping, lineages of people who shared, or at least um, purported to share the same ancestry. The spirit of sharing was still there. No household would suffer due to a failure of crop. Prestige came from not individual consumption, but from the ability to help the next person, to help make up for the deficiencies of others. Values of the Neolithic period are still very similar to the hunter-gathering society. An example would be in the early 18th century, observers of the Iroquois horticulturists noted If a cabin of hungry Iroquois meets another whose provisions are not entirely exhausted, the latter share with their newcomers the little which remains to them without waiting to be asked, although they expose themselves thereby to the same dangers of perishing as those whom they help. Another study of the Nuer noted in general it can be said that no one in the Nuer village starves unless all are starving. So we can see that there was a redistribution system during the Neolithic period that ensured that groups were protected from dying out. The change in the method of production had a profound effect on reproduction too. Women could have more children, more than one child. Under hunting and gathering, the need to carry children on the daily round of gathering and on the period moves of the whole camp um, led to very low birth rates. Now, within a fixed village, life was based on agriculture. The child did not have to be carried everywhere. Um, it was the child did not have to be carried once it was a few months old. The greater the number of children, the greater the area of land that could be cleared and cultivated in the future. The village had stocks of stored food and artifacts which provided a motive for attacks by armed raiders from outside. Now, war was not something that was known in the hunter-gatherer society, and now it became an endemic amongst the agriculturalists. Now, if there was a dispute in the hunter-gatherer society, people could leave or split, the bands could split. In the village life, things became a bit more tricky and complex because the village was larger and the people had to organize in the clearing of land, the planting, the watering of plants, the storage of food. This made way for the formation of decision-making mechanisms to exercise social control. For example, councils made up of senior figures in each lineage. So now we see a new type of leadership emerging. So the development of agriculture led to the formation of a social elite that was of making decisions and managing the community. Later groups specialized in the production of food, manufacturing of products, and the trade of food and craft products, as well as the defense and management of the community. People now had these differentiated social ranks within the community. What anthropologists call chieftainships or big men arose, with some individuals or lineages enjoying much greater prestige than others, and this could culminate in the establishment of hereditary chiefs and chiefly lineages. But egalitarianism and sharing remained. Those people with high status, they had to serve the rest of the community and not exploit it or live on it. For example, the Nambiquara of South America. Generosity is an essential attribute to the power, and the chief must be prepared to use the surplus quantities of food, tools, weapons, and ornaments under his control to respond to the appeal of an individual, a family, or the band as a whole for anything they need. In New Guinea, for example, the clubhouse leader has to work harder than anyone else so they can keep up the stocks of food. When we look at the disadvantages of the agricultural revolution, now people started to heavily depend on a certain food crops. The failure of these food crops led to disaster, led to starvation if they failed. People had to stay permanently. They could no longer just pick up and go as they had in the past. Crops and animals, they had crops and animals to tend to now. They could not just, if you were in dispute with someone else, you had a grudge, you couldn't just go join another band or you had to stay. Um, so people could not pick up and just go because they also had plants to take care of. Close contact with animals exposed them to diseases. There was trade and sometimes raid between nomads and agriculturalists. So this also brought on lots of wars for some areas. Eventually, agricultural populations began to spread, displacing or assimilating nomadic groups. Farming groups grew large enough for advanced and social organization. So the agricultural revolution was a radical change in lifestyle and allowed for a systematic development of humankind. Farming and the domestication of animals made possible larger concentrations of people and rising populations while providing materials for new forms of communication, warfare, and technology. It provided the foundation for subsequent revolutions, which mark the further stages in the development of our civilization. Now, these changes paved the way for civilization to emerge. Thank you so much for attending this lecture. Enjoy the rest of your day.